chained to a wooden block, surrounded by English soldiers who hated her, a 19-year-old girl waited to die. But before the flames consumed Joan of Arc, she endured months of psychological torture, sexual threats, and a rigged trial designed to break her spirit. This is what really happened in those final days. If you want to dive deep into the darkest and most untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the truth behind legends, one story at a time now. Let's go back to May 1430. By the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc had become the most dangerous symbol in France. She was just 18 years old, a peasant girl from the village of Domremy who could barely read or write. Yet she had done what France's greatest nobles could not. She had broken the Siege of Orléans. She had led French forces to victory after victory against the English, and on July 17, 1429, she had stood beside Charles VII in Reims Cathedral as he was crowned King of France. The English occupation, which had seemed unstoppable, was crumbling. French morale, once shattered, had been resurrected, and all of it centered on one young woman who claimed God himself had sent her to save France. The English knew they could not defeat her legend by military force alone. They needed to destroy what she represented. They needed to prove she was not chosen by God, but deceived by demons. To do that, they needed her alive. On May 23, 1430, during a military skirmish at Compiègne, Joan of Arc was pulled from her horse and captured. But it was not the English who took her. It was the Burgundians, French nobles who had allied themselves with England during the Civil War, tearing France apart. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, controlled much of northern France and had sided with the English crown against Charles VII. Joan became the most valuable prisoner in Europe overnight. The Burgundians held her for months, knowing exactly what they possessed. In November 1430, a deal was struck. The English paid 10,000 livres tournois to the Burgundians for custody of Joan of Arc. To put that in perspective, this was equivalent to the price of 1,000 warhorses, an extraordinary sum that reflected her strategic importance. Joan was not treated as a prisoner of war. She was treated as a commodity. She was transferred to Rouen, the administrative capital of English-occupied France, and placed under the direct control of the English military command. The Earl of Warwick, one of England's most powerful nobles, personally oversaw her imprisonment. In the castle at Beauvais, the English strategy was clear. If they could put Joan on trial and convict her of heresy, they would accomplish two goals at once. First, they would delegitimize Charles VII's coronation. If Joan was a heretic guided by demons, then the king she crowned had no divine right to rule. Second, they would crush French morale by proving that their greatest hero was nothing more than a witch. Joan had gone from the girl who turned the tide of the 100 Years' War to a prisoner locked in an English fortress, guarded by the very soldiers whose armies she had defeated. The psychological shock must have been immense. She had been abandoned by the king she crowned. Charles VII made no attempt to ransom her, no effort to negotiate her release. The nobleman who had fought beside her did nothing. She was alone. But the English didn't just want to imprison her, they wanted to destroy her soul. From the moment Joan arrived at the castle of Beauvais in Rouen, her imprisonment violated every principle of canon law. According to the legal standards of the medieval church, female prisoners accused of heresy were required to be held in church prisons and guarded by women, typically nuns. This was not just custom, it was law, designed to protect the dignity and safety of female prisoners. During ecclesiastical trials, Joan of Arc was given none of these protections. She was held in a secular military fortress under the direct control of English military authorities. Her guards were not nuns. They were common English soldiers who viewed her as an enemy combatant, and the reason their armies had suffered devastating defeats. The conditions of her imprisonment were brutal. Joan was chained to a heavy wooden block, even when confined to her cell. At times, iron shackles were placed on her feet to further restrict her movement. She could not stand fully. She could not walk freely. She was physically bound every hour of every day. But the physical restraints were only part of her suffering. According to witness testimony given at the Rehabilitation trial in 1456, 5 guards were assigned to watch her at all times. 3 guards remained inside her cell continuously. 2 more were posted outside the door. Joan had no privacy, no respite, no moment where she was not under the watch of men who despised her. The psychological torment was constant. The guards taunted her mercilessly. They reminded her that she would burn. They mocked her claims of divine visions. They called her a witch, a heretic, a liar. This was not the treatment of a prisoner of war. This was deliberate psychological warfare designed to break her spirit before the trial even began. But the danger Joan faced went far beyond verbal abuse. Their testimony from the 1456 Rehabilitation trial, which heard from 115 witnesses, revealed that Joan had been subjected to physical threats and sexual intimidation during her imprisonment. One witness explicitly stated that a great English lord had attempted to assault her in her cell. Joan lived in constant fear, not just of execution, but of violation. This is why Joan refused to stop wearing men's clothing, despite knowing it would be used against her in the trial. The charge of wearing male clothing was one of the central accusations of heresy the English planned to use to convict her. Under medieval interpretation of biblical law, it was considered a serious transgression for a woman to dress as a man. But Joan's reasoning was practical, not defiant. Men's clothing of that era was tightly laced and bound, making it far more difficult to remove by force. A woman's dress, by contrast, offered no protection. Joan argued repeatedly to her interrogators that it was more proper to dress as a man, when surrounded by male guards, than to wear women's clothing that left her vulnerable to assault. The judges dismissed her reasoning entirely. They treated her refusal to wear a dress as an act of heresy, not an act of self-preservation. It would ultimately become one of the charges that condemned her to death. In March 1431, Joan fell seriously ill. She suffered from a high fever and believed she might die in her cell. Faced with the possibility of death, she begged to receive the sacraments, the final rites of the Catholic Church. She also asked that if she died, her body be buried on sacred ground, as was the right of any Christian. Both requests were denied. The English authorities refused to allow her access to a priest or the sacraments. The Earl of Warwick, who oversaw her imprisonment, did eventually intervene to ensure she received some medical care. But his concern was not compassion, it was financial. The English had paid the equivalent price of 1,000 horses for Joan of Arc. They intended to extract full political value from her trial and execution. She could not be allowed to die in a cell before they had publicly destroyed her. Joan recovered from the illness, but the message was clear. She had no rights, no protections, no dignity. She was completely at the mercy of men who wanted her dead, but only after they had humiliated her in front of all of France. She lived in constant fear, not just of the flames that awaited her, but of what might happen to her in the darkness of that cell. Surrounded by guards who saw her not as a prisoner, but as an enemy. While her body suffered in chains, her mind was about to face an even crueler test. On January 3, 1431, formal charges were issued against Joan of Arc. She would be tried by an ecclesiastical court on accusations of heresy, witchcraft, and crimes against the Church. The trial was presented as a legitimate religious proceeding, but it was a carefully orchestrated political weapon from the beginning. The man chosen to lead the trial was Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais. Cauchon was not a neutral judge. He had served for years as an advisor to the English occupation government in France. He owed his position and his wealth to English patronage. His loyalty was never in question. The English needed a conviction, and Cauchon would deliver it. 42 clerics, theologians, and church officials were assembled to form the tribunal. On the surface, it appeared to be a legitimate church court. In reality, it was a show trial, designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. The goal was not justice. The goal was to prove that Joan of Arc was a heretic, that her visions came not from God, but from demons, and that the king she crowned had no divine right to rule. The charges against her were carefully selected. She was accused of wearing men's clothing in violation of biblical law. She was accused of claiming to receive divine visions, which the church argued could be evidence of demonic possession, and she was accused of refusing to submit to the authority of the church, the ultimate definition of heresy in medieval Catholicism. The formal interrogations began on February 21, 1431. Joan was led into the chapel of Beauvais Castle to face Bishop Cauchon in the assembled tribunal. She agreed to swear an oath to answer questions truthfully, but she made one condition clear. She would not reveal anything that might compromise King Charles VII. This defiance set the tone for everything that followed. Between February 21st and March 24th, Joan endured nearly a dozen interrogation sessions. The questions were relentless, repetitive, and deliberately designed to trap her. The clerics were not seeking the truth. They were searching for contradictions, admissions, or statements that could be twisted into evidence of heresy. They pressed her on the nature of her visions. They demanded she describe the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret in precise detail. They asked her how she knew the voices were from God and not from the devil. They questioned her refusal to wear women's clothing. They challenged her claim that God had sent her to save France. Their questions were carefully constructed so that no matter how Joan answered, she would incriminate herself. But Joan was not an uneducated peasant girl who could be easily manipulated. She had spent months in the presence of kings, nobles, and military commanders. She had negotiated sieges and debated theology with scholars. She understood the traps being set for her. The most famous moment of the trial came when the clerics asked Joan whether she believed she was in a state of grace. It was a question designed to be impossible to answer correctly. According to Catholic doctrine, no person could know with absolute certainty whether they possessed God's grace. If Joan answered yes, she would be contradicting church teaching and claiming knowledge that only God could have. If she answered no, she would be admitting that her visions could not be from God, because a person without grace could not receive divine revelations. Joan paused. Then she gave an answer that stunned even her interrogators. She said, "If I am not in a state of grace, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a perfect response. She neither claimed to know her spiritual state with certainty, nor did she deny the possibility of God's grace. Even the clerics who wanted her dead could find no fault with the answer. For a moment, the trap had failed, but the trial continued. The initial list of 70 charges against Joan could not be sustained. Most were based on rumor, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. The prosecutors were forced to reduce the accusations to 12 articles. Even then, Joan defended herself with such intelligence and clarity that some members of the tribunal began to question the legitimacy of the proceedings. One tribunal member, Nicolas de Hoopville, openly stated that the testimony was being coerced and manipulated to entrap Joan rather than seek the truth. He stepped down from the court in protest. Another cleric, Jean Lawyer, challenged Bishop Cauchon's rights to judge the case, arguing that the trial violated canon law. He was immediately imprisoned. The irregularities were undeniable. Canon law required that a person be tried in their home diocese. Joan was from Domremy, which fell under the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Toul. The trial was being held in Rouen, far outside the proper jurisdiction. Joan was given no legal counsel to advise or defend her. She was interrogated 4 weeks before the formal charges were even read to her. Evidence from the later Rehabilitation trial, in 1456, suggests that the trial transcripts were falsified at key points to make Joan's statements appear more incriminating than they actually were. This was not a trial. It was a judicial execution, dressed in the robes of religious authority. Joan was fighting alone against the combined power of the English crown and a corrupted church court. She had no allies, no defenders, and no hope of acquittal. But even brilliance couldn't save her from what came next. On May 23, 1431, Joan of Arc was brought before the tribunal and informed of the verdict. Theologians from the University of Paris, the most respected theological authority in Europe, had reviewed her case. Their conclusion was final and absolute. Joan's claims to hear divine voices were declared to be the work of demons. Her wearing of men's clothing was condemned as unnatural and wicked. Her refusal to submit unconditionally to the authority of the Church made her a heretic. The sentence was clear. If she did not recant her claims and admit that she had deceived the people of France, she would be handed over to secular authorities for execution by burning. The following day, May 24th, Joan was taken to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. A large crowd had gathered. In the center of the cemetery stood a wooden stake, already prepared for her execution. The sight must have been overwhelming. Joan was 19 years old. She had been imprisoned for months in brutal conditions. She had been interrogated, threatened, and abandoned by the king she had crowned. Charles VII had made no effort to save her. No ransom had been offered. No rescue was coming. Faced with the immediate reality of death, Joan broke. She agreed to sign a document of abjuration, a formal recantation of her claims. The exact wording of what she signed remains disputed, but the effect was clear. She admitted that she had lied about her visions. She confessed that she had deceived the people of France. In exchange, Her sentence was commuted from execution to life imprisonment. She was ordered to wear a woman's dress and never again to claim divine inspiration. Joan complied. She put on the dress. She returned to her cell. For a brief moment, it seemed the English had achieved their goal. They had broken the symbol of French resistance and forced her to publicly confess her fraud. But Joan's recantation lasted only a few days. When Bishop Cauchon and other judges visited her cell shortly after, they found her once again dressed in men's clothing. The reasons for this remain debated by historians to this day. According to the trial record, Joan stated that she had resumed wearing men's clothing of her own free will. She said the voices of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret had appeared to her and reproached her for denying the truth to save her life. She claimed she would rather die than continue living in denial of what God had commanded her to do. But testimony from the 1456 Rehabilitation trial, which sought to overturn the original verdict, told a different story. Multiple witnesses testified that the guards had deliberately stolen Joan's dress during the night and left her nothing to wear except the men's clothing. She was forced to put it on or remain naked. The truth is likely a combination of both accounts. The guards may have set the trap, but Joan chose to walk into it. After days of reflection in her cell, wearing a dress that left her vulnerable to the same soldiers who had tormented and threatened her, Joan made a decision. She would rather die with dignity than live the rest of her life imprisoned, humiliated, and stripped of everything she believed to be true. On May 28, Bishop Cauchon and 7 other judges returned to interrogate Joan one final time. She told them clearly that she had resumed wearing men's clothing because it was necessary for protection while imprisoned among men, and that her voices had rebuked her for recanting. Under canon law, a relapsed heretic, someone who recanted and then returned to their heresy, could not be given a second chance. On May 29th, the judges reached a unanimous decision. Joan of Arc would be handed over to secular authorities. The sentence was death by burning. On May 30th, 1431, they led her to the marketplace. What happened next would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was allowed to receive the sacraments of the Catholic Church. Technically, this was illegal. A condemned heretic was not entitled to the last rites, but even some of her judges understood what was about to happen, and mercy, however small, was extended in her final hours. She was then led from her cell at Bouverolles Castle to the Place du Vieux Marché, the old marketplace in the heart of Rouen. A large crowd had gathered. In the center of the square stood a tall plastered pillar. Joan was tied to it, bound so tightly she could not move. As the executioners prepared the fire, Joan made one final request. She asked to see a cross as she died. An English soldier, moved by her plea, took 2 sticks and fashioned a crude cross. He handed it to her. Joan kissed it and held it against her chest. Then a processional crucifix was brought from the nearby church of Saints. Joan embraced it. Her hands were bound, but the cross was held before her eyes so she could see it as the flames were lit. The fire was set. Witnesses present that day recorded what they saw and heard. As the flames rose around her, Joan cried out repeatedly. Her voice carried above the roar of the fire and the noise of the crowd. Her final word, shouted again and again until the smoke choked her breath, was the name of Jesus. At 19 years of age, the peasant girl who had changed the course of the 100 Years' War died in the marketplace of Rouen, but the English were not finished. After Joan's death, the executioners were ordered to burn her remains 2 more times to ensure that nothing was left. No bones, no relics, no physical trace of her existence. When they were satisfied that her body had been reduced entirely to ash, those ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine River. The English believed they had erased Joan of Arc from history. They believed that by destroying her body and convicting her of heresy, they had destroyed her legacy. They were wrong. 25 years later, in 1456, a rehabilitation trial was convened at the request of Joan's mother, Isabelle Romy. The trial heard testimony from 115 witnesses, including people who had known Joan, soldiers who had fought beside her, and clerics who had been present at the original proceedings. The court reviewed the evidence, the trial transcripts, and the circumstances of her imprisonment and execution. The verdict was unambiguous. The 1431 trial was declared invalid. It had been tainted by political bias, riddled with procedural errors, and conducted in violation of canon law. Joan of Arc was officially exonerated. Her conviction was overturned. The heretic was declared innocent. But her story did not end there. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The woman who had been burned as a heretic became Saint Joan of Arc, patron saint of France. If you had been standing in that marketplace on May 30th, 1431, watching as a 19-year-old girl called out to God while flames consumed her, would you have recognized the execution for what it truly was? Judicial murder disguised as religious justice. The trial that condemned Joan of Arc was never about heresy. It was about destroying the symbol that had made French victory possible, an English occupation untenable. The English needed to prove she was not chosen by God. They needed to break the morale of a nation that had rallied behind her. They needed to delegitimize the king she had crowned. But symbols cannot be burned, legends cannot be erased, and the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually comes to light. Joan of Arc died in the flames, but her story became immortal. Joan of Arc's story didn't end in those flames. It began there. From prisoner to saint, from heretic to hero, history has a way of revealing the truth. If this story moved you, hit the like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Joan really heard divine voices? Or was she simply a brilliant, courageous girl caught in a war between kings? Either way, she changed history forever. Subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest, most powerful stories from the past. Because every legend has a truth behind it, and we're here to uncover it. See you in the next one.